Tukua te wairua, kia rere ki ngā taumata, hei ārahi i a tātou mai me tā tātou whai i ngā tikanga a rātou mā, kia mau, kia ita, kia koreo e ngaro, kia pūpuri, kia wakamaua, kia tīna, aumie, uie, tā ki e. Well, kia ora tātou, nau mai hoki mai ki Indigenising Design, a six-part webinar series on how we might change the world through Indigenous and BIPOC lenses. Ko Johnson Witehira Māua, ko Kei Te Twist tēnei. I'm Johnson, currently over at Massey University and hosting this alongside Kei Te Twist here from IDIA. We're really thrilled to be part of this second series. And we've got some really amazing speakers today. How the series came about a little bit. And it started as a collaboration between the British Council, the University of Exeter, connecting with IDIA around decolonising design. We love that our non-Indigenous and non-BIPOC partners, are front-footing this change that needs to happen, and are bringing us into the conversation and actually are enabling Indigenous people to actually lead this conversation on their behalf and help and open those doors. In this series, we're talking about indigenising global systems and decolonising global systems. It's a huge topic and a huge kaupapa. In terms of questions and answers today, we're aiming to take some questions live for those attending. If you want to ask a question here, there's a Q&A tab at the top of your screen. Click on that and we'll open the question panel, and all questions will be semi-curated, mostly because there might be sort of some overlapping themes in those. So we'll sort of try and pull those through together if we can. Just getting over, I guess, to today's tangata rongonui e Pūkene. Amazing speakers from around the world. I will also just say that we will be dropping in te reo Māori, so Māori language throughout this kōrero, this speech that we're having today. We'll put subtitles throughout later on for some of those listening. But those are mostly, again, put there as a way to help us decolonise the space and ensure that it's our language, our whakaaro, our thoughts that are shaping not only the way that we talk about these topics, but also the way that that we, I think, sort of pull them apart in the lens that we bring to it. With today's amazing speakers, we've got three. Luckily for us, one in Aotearoa here, Dr. Jess Hutchings. Jess is a founding trustee of the Papa Whakarito Charitable Trust that works to uplift Māori kai and soil sovereignty and kua parakore through research, development and community practice. With Professor Brian Martin here, Director of the Womenjeka, the Jimbana Indigenous Research Lab in Monash over in Australia. So thanks, Brian, for getting up early and for being on us with us this morning. And then we've got Dr. Dori Tunstall, design anthropologist, design leader, and author of Decolonising Design, a cultural justice handbook, and also founder and lead executive officer of Dori Tunstall. I don't want to talk too much because you guys aren't here to listen to me. You're here to listen to these amazing speakers. The format with this is we give each of our speakers 5 or so minutes to introduce themselves, to talk about some of their work, and then we bring up some questions that we've workshopped prior to today. Kia ora anō. I'm going to hand it over to Jess right now just to introduce herself. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Johnson. No I whakatūwhera tuhui nei, mihi atu kia koe. Kia koutou katoa, ka tai mai I tēnei ata, mihi atu kia koutou. Ko au he uri o ngai tahu Ngāti Huirapa me Gujarat, India ahau. He Mindian, he Māori Indian. He mihi anō kia koutou. Kia ora everybody, just a quick translation acknowledging Johnson for opening up and clearing the way, the whakawātea through karakia for our hui today, for our webinar. My name's Dr. Jessica Hutchings, and I hail from the tribe Ngaitahu Ngāti Huirapa in the South Island of New Zealand, and I also too whakapapa to Gujarat, to a village called Matwad out near Dundee Beach in India. So I'm a Mindian, a Māori Indian, and there's not very many of us. Thank you very much for the invitation to come and share kōrero today on this really important kaupapa. I love it because it's international and it's global. I love it because we're thinking about decolonising global food systems, which, and I won't get too much into it now, but for me, it's all about how we can enable this fall of the capitalist patriarchy through our decolonial work that we're doing. I would describe myself as a recovered academic, having done probably 15 years in the white knowledge, the white towers of knowledge production in the universities, and found it very hard for someone who has a science background to take Indigenous science into the academy 20 years ago. So subsequently, I've been working as a freelancer or an independent Indigenous kaupapa Māori researcher at the interface of science, society and Indigenous knowledge. So in those liminal spaces, maybe marginal spaces as bell hooks might describe them, but definitely a place where there is, and to use a Hooks quote, a community of resistors. And so we have a beautiful saying in our culture, e hara te taki to, e hara te taki o te taki, e hara te tō te taki tahi, te tō o te taki tini. Whew, early to get my mouth around that one. It's not the strength of one, it's the strength of many. And this is why this notion of a community of resistors, of which I've worked with Johnson in the past to actually use design work to help us think about how we can reimagine these new Indigenous worlds. In the last 3 or 4 years, I have established a charitable trust, which has been really new for me, called Papa Whakaritorito. We're all things there to elevate Indigenous food, seed and soil sovereignty. So food sovereignty begins in seed sovereignty, which begins in soil sovereignty. And the work that I do, I really strongly believe that it is the recovering of our Indigenous foodways and our food systems that is really going to support the reimagining of these new worlds for Indigenous communities, but for that world in general. I am a Māori organic farmer. I might not look like it today, but I'm a Māori organic farmer, wearing my gumboots and out there in the paddocks wrangling our animals with a lot of love and care, and growing kai on our farm, which we've been on this land for 22 years now, and we live intergenerationally. We have big Māori organic gardens, we run workshops, we host Indigenous peoples, we're really promoting Indigenous seed banking and really trying to grow that in Aotearoa amongst our Indigenous communities. The last thing I want to do is I want to really acknowledge Johnson and his leadership in Te Ao Māori in our country, in Aotearoa, for being one of these tangata puku mahi, this person who works incredibly hard but has this beautiful ability to connect and to bring communities together. And it's been a real privilege for us as researchers to have an opportunity to work with design and to bring kaupapa Māori design to be able to help tell the outcomes and the findings of Indigenous-led research. So, nei rā te mihi ki a koe, Johnson. Kia koutou katoa, mauri ora.
Oh, kia ora e kare, you're making me blush. That's so nice. And let's keep working together. I'm going to pass it over to you now, Brian, to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your mahi. Kia ora.
Yeah, thank you, Johnson. So yam nende niga nyam mala garaging nalagar jungen nigare mala jungen wala jala mala guru gala jungen nala mala jungen nigara mala jungen igen yima garaging waterong jungen nagara banjo bunya muna Brian Martin nagara dirwang banjalang jungen Bayami Guliju Gamilore jungen Murirori jungen. I just said hello, everyone. We belong to country, we look after country, we don't do harm around country, we don't do wrong around country, and we belong to country. I show my respects for Wurrung country and other Jungan country, where people are joining us from on this webinar, and also extend that respects to the creation ancestors of Bunjil, who's a great creator ancestor of the Kulin Nations in central Victoria in Australia, and also paying my respects to my ancestors and creation ancestors of Dirrawong, who's a Bunjalung ancestor, creation ancestor, and Bayami, who's one of our leading great ancestors in Mudawari and Panjalang and Mudawari and Gamilaroi country. So my name is Brian Martin. As Jonathan said, I'm the director of Wominjeka Jinbaan Indigenous Research Lab in Monash University in Victoria in Australia, Southeast Australia. My ancestry comes from northern New South Wales in Australia, which is Bunjalung, Gamilaroi, Mudawari. My connection to that place goes over 3,000 generations. We have a connection to that area around 80,000 years. Out of that 80,000+ years, I've been a practicing artist for about 30 years. There's a drop in the ocean. And I've been leading the Wominjeka Jinbaan Indigenous Research Lab at Monash for the last 5 years. And to give a bit of a definition of what those words Wominjeka Jinbaan mean, they're Bunwurrung words created by Ngāwi Professor Caroline Briggs, to really say, Wominjeka means welcome with the purpose and obligations and relational accountability to place. And Jinbana means a place of gathering and exchanging of ideas, bartering and swapping sort of, practices and so on. So it's a place, welcome to a place of learning, really, and that's what the research lab is about. And our research in that lab looks at the synergies between practice-led research across the disciplines of art, design and architecture with Indigenous knowledge production globally. So a lot of our researchers are from different parts of the world. It's an exciting place to work and to lead in so many different ways, to museum practices, to shifting ethnographic and anthropological practices of the Western discourse from an Indigenous knowledge sort of premise. So it's a really exciting thing. I also make drawings. I try to in my spare time. That's really, I'd love to be a recovered academic so I can become a real artist one day. So I don't have that time, but look, it's an honour to be invited to this talk, and it's great to see Johnson, Jessica, and of course Dory, and really looking forward to our discussion this morning, this evening, depending where you are. So, Moraba, thank you.
Oh, kia ora, Brian. I really loved how you located yourself in that 80,000 years of whakapapa. I think it's for us, it's going to be a big part of our conversation today, around how we see ourselves in this sort of this timeline that's much, much further than our own individual lives. Hopefully you can continue to do a bit more art. Academia has its challenges, doesn't it? But I'm hoping following this we can kind of get into those collaborations, those art collaborations too. But thank you so much. I'm just going to pass it over to you now, Dory, and love to hear about your experiences and what you're doing now as well. Kia ora.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Dory Tunstall. I'm a multi-generational African American. So I was born in Columbia, South Carolina, on the lands of the Catawba, Pidi, Jikura, Adisto, Santee, Yamasee, and Jikura Waccamo nations. I grew up in Indianapolis, Indiana, on the lands of the Kickapoo, Kaskaskia, and Miami nations, and I currently live on occupied land originally and still inhabited and cared for by the Tongva, Tatavam, Serrano Kush, and Chumash peoples. So I pay my honor and respect to the Indigenous elders and descendants, past, present, and emerging, as they continue their stewardship over these lands and waters. And I pay my respects to my ancestors who have sacrificed over generations to provide the gift of liberation to me and to those who come afterwards. So that's kind of where I am. What I do is I'm a design anthropologist, which means I work at the intersections of culture and design. So constantly trying to figure out, like, what is the relationship to the values that people have, the way they're given form through design, and then whether or not people are actually experiencing the values through the way in which the form that they've been given. I've kind of worked globally. So I did my PhD research in Ethiopia. Again, moved to Australia to work at Swinburne University of Technology in Narm. Then moved to Toronto in Canada to at the call for the time is the dean of the faculty design, and the call was to look for someone who could bring facilitate a process of decolonization, and I think the term they use, Indigenous revitalization. And so because I actually had a tremendous experience working with very generous and open Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in NARM, I was able to bring that experiences of how to create space in many ways for Indigenous ways of knowing and being accepted and celebrated within a design curriculum. I was actually able to bring that work to Canada to further the work of Indigenous artists and designers who were really doing that work already, and just being in a position of power as a dean to get out of the way of that amazing work. And now I've returned back a year and a half to United States to meet family obligations. And so now I run Dory Tunstall Inc., a firm dedicated to decolonizing and diversifying institutional processes through just strategic consulting, leadership coaching, care shops, because Emancipation Proclamation means I don't work, and customizable curriculum. And as Johnson's indicated, I'm also the author of Decolonising Design, a cultural justice guidebook, which was published in 2023 by MIT Press. And the first chapter of that book was putting Indigenous first, which I'll kind of talk about more in terms of like a lot of the experiences I've had in terms of putting that into practice, and more importantly, figuring out how to live in a way where you're constantly putting Indigenous first. Thank you.
Kia ora, Dory. I'm really glad that you brought up MIT Press. I wrote a little note in that because for those online, like, that's a really big deal, have anything published at all by MIT Press. So when I saw your book come out originally, Dory, I was just sort of blown away to see finally something come through in that platform. But I didn't realize the depth of your international scholarship, and how in many ways I think that makes you really suited to be an author on a book like that. I'm so excited. My heart's pounding right now. And we want to get into decolonizing global design systems. So thank you, Dory. I'm going to jump over, I guess, into the first sort of question that we'd framed up for Jess to sort of respond to. And as you guys listening again, we'll see we try and make this as dynamic as we can, and we'll try and move it around a bit. But we've given each of our speakers kind of a question as well to sort of help us jumping around. But starting with you, Jess, You know, in our experience, certain aspects and customs and practices are common in Indigenous people, and one of these commonalities is a sense of connection to something bigger than ourselves and our place, and how we locate ourselves and have a connection to that. Looking to your mahi and Māori food sovereignty, you know, it helps us connect to Papa Tuanuku, you know, to recognise her mana. It helps us understand both the rise of mana wahine and the role of wahine in te ao hurihuri in our changing world. In a past conversation, I guess we spoke about how we are starting to experience the slow death of capitalism. I think some of us would like it to be a bit faster. But we also talked about reconnecting ourselves to the whenua through this, to gifts that we've inherited through our whakapapa and our genealogy, and how things might change and grow out of the space. So I'm keen, I guess, to hear your whakaaro, to hear your thoughts on all this. I know it's a really big question, but just starting it wherever you want.
Kia ora, Johnson. He pātai nui tēnā. It's a really big question, but it's a really important question for our time. And probably want to start in this period of the long dark that we find ourselves in at the moment. And this long dark is, you know, how I describe the slow death of capitalism. And it is a slow death of capitalism, and we're seeing it happening right before us right now. In the death throes, it will probably be 2 to 3 generations. And you know, for most of us, I'm looking at our age group on the webinar, we definitely, for myself, I grew up in a time where materiality was all around us. The consumption of capitalism, of what capitalism provided, went unchecked in everyday life. And 30, 40 years later, you know, in my lifespan, we're checking everything in which capitalism provides, because we now understand the impact that it has on our Indigenous worlds. So if we just hold that long dark, or that long dark is holding us at the moment, we're in it, we're in this demise of capitalism, we have to then think about what we reimagine as Indigenous communities as these new worlds for our mokopuna and our generations to come. What is our role then as Indigenous wayfinders, leaders, activists, academics, gardeners, artists, creatives? What is our role then while we're actually in this period of the long dark? And how can we actually then re-envisage what these new worlds look like? And then I come to probably where your question started, Johnson, which is about connection and belonging and whakapapa. So we know that even while when our tūpuna, when our ancestors travelled over the big long stretches of water that connect us all across Te Moana Nui a Kiwa, across the Pacific, that there were times when they were unsure and they were uncertain about what lay ahead. But there was an understanding and a knowing that actually we are grounded and rooted to our culture and to our tikanga, to our cultural practices and to our whakapapa, to where we come from. And if we can take that positionality and our deep connection that we have with nature, and I say a deep connection because it's not just I think that what the offering of the Indigenous imaginary is in the future for food, the future imaginaries for restoring our Indigenous foodways, is almost a return that's a deep ecology return. So we hear so many people very quickly, you know, mihi kia rangi nui kia papa tūnuku, greet the Sky Father, greet the Earth Mother, acknowledge all of our other atua and our deity. But on the everyday level, what does that deeply mean in terms of returning to live and practice life in ways which really honour Indigenous spirit and our Indigenous deity, like every day in the doing of it? Because our tūpuna, our ancestors in Aotearoa, and I'll speak for our culture only, knew that their survival was deeply bound with the realms of the atua and being able to read the signs of nature, to be able to connect with the whakapapa, and to every day strengthen those whakapapa connections through things like karakia, through things like gathering food, through planting and harvesting crops, again through karakia. But the elevation of the atua, of the deities, is right at the heart of that. So that might all sound a bit kind of like, oh yeah, is that really going to do it for the decolonising global food systems? I really am not seeing or hearing another way, and this is when I turn to the whakaaro of Indigenous women, and in particular Māori women in Aotearoa, to be the wayfinders and to lead the way here. And why Indigenous women? Because Indigenous women are closest than any other communities of people on this planet to Papa Tuanuku and to Ranginui, to our Earth Mother and to our Sky Father. Now, I don't want to get into essentialising the gendered body. Let's talk about mana wahine, gendered body as female, but let's talk about mana wahine as a discourse and as a body of knowledge that we can come to understand. So it's a time now where Indigenous women's voices are rising. They're not mincing words. They're very clear about the state of the world and where it's at in the death throes and the long dark of the end of capitalist patriarchy. And then the emergence of this new world is something that actually we have to work hard to imagine it beyond the current boxes in which we think in. And this is where I really appreciate the work that I've done with designers, with Indigenous designers, because it's through your work, Johnson, and maybe later we'll be able to throw up that beautiful slide that you did to help us reimagine what a Māori food system might look like. So when we can place images or design or creative work, mahi toi, in front of our communities that can act as a stepping stone to reimagine these new worlds, people get out of their heads, and then they're not thinking about the death of capitalism, got to plant kai or save seeds, but actually we're being taken over. Indigenous design can take us over to that next bridge. So maybe we could just skip to that middle slide just while I'm talking to it. Thank you. Whoever's on the we almost had it. Ka pai, kia ora. Kia ora. So mihi atu kia koe. This is Johnson's mahi. And this was funded through a 3-year research project, Indigenous-led research project called Kai Atua, Food for Hope and Wellbeing, funded by the Royal Society of New Zealand. And we really wanted to reimagine what a Māori food system looks like. And through lots of kōrero, working with designers, working with our Indigenous peoples and communities, this is where we landed. And when I show this to Māori communities, it's not what they imagined that they would get when we say, what do you think of a Māori food system? They might see mara or rows of gardens. But what we have here in the middle very quickly is Ranginui, our Sky Father, connected obviously to the relationship below with Papa Tuanuku, our Earth Mother. And then we have the representation of Te iwi Māori on either side of that, with different tiki from different marae or rohi or tribal areas around the country. So we're retaining that specific positionality, that Indigenous positionality in different tribal areas. But we're also too, there's a history in here, as you can see when you look at the objects, traditional food objects like kumara, sweet potato, kawa, which is a rongoa, a traditional medicine. But obviously too now we are big growers of kiwi fruit in commercial markets, using a mixture of modern tools and traditional tools. So actually our food system is everything. It's everything Maira Nor from the past, and it's everything that's in the future, that's in the contemporary world. But what doesn't change within it is the whakapapa, is the ranginui and Papa Tuanuku, and our placed baseness of locating our indigeneity within our rohi. So while I say we need to reimagine these new worlds and the long dark and the death of the capitalist patriarchy, there are some very key markers that stay in position. our whakapapa, our mana, our wairua, and our pakiwaitara, our stories around our atua in the creation. So he whakaro no iho. Thank you, Jonathan, for doing this wonderful design, because it's made its way around the motu in Aotearoa in Indigenous communities. We've printed it up on postcards. I talk about it all the time. It's in our new book that's coming out next month, Pātaka Kai, Growing Kai Sovereignty. So, you know, if we've got a food security crisis, we need to reimagine our way out of that. And thank you to the Indigenous designers for helping us to do it. Kia ora.
Oh, kia ora, kare. I took a lot of notes. I always take notes because I'm always learning things from any time I sit on one of these. And one of the things I really picked up and what you talked about and what I love around how food can be such a simple thing in some ways, but I guess capitalist systems in many ways disconnect us from that. You know, like the business of our modern lives mean it is harder for us to spend times in our gardens, you know, in our mara, with our hands in the dirt. And these are things, you know, that in very simple ways can connect us to not just the whenua, but our worldviews, you know, how we see and understand the world. And, you know, I picked up on what you mentioned too around how, you know, within Aotearoa, a lot of us, we mihi, we acknowledge to this deity in the world around us. I think it's a beautiful thing that in the contemporary context, we're still strongly able to do that. But like you said, how many of us really live that sort of world? And again, I think for me, in a way, capitalism puts a lot of blockers in front of us, you know, in terms of us being able to live that sort of life. And I remember hearing something similar around when people mihi to their monia, to their mountain or to their rivers, and someone said, but how often do you go to your river? How often do you go to your mountain that you call yours? And you know, I think part of this wider conversation we're having today is how do we remove those blockers, those things that enable us to be Indigenous in a contemporary world, but also enable us to heal the world and make it better. The last thing I was just going to add on this was a note was around that you talked about us being able to survive in the natural world was connected to this really deep understanding of the natural world and really deep connection to it. And with that in mind, I thought I might head over to you, Brian, thinking around the longevity that your people have had, you know, within Australia and the deep connection needed to survive in a landscape that is much harsher than here in Aotearoa. We've only got, we don't even have poisonous anything. We don't have dangerous anything. So it's phenomenal, and I imagine phenomenal that your people have survived so long, but the mātauranga Māori, the body of knowledge that they must have accumulated over the $80,000 years, it's just, you know, immense. And I'd be really keen again to, I guess, direct things over towards you and start to get your perspective on what we've been talking about so far.
Yeah, thank you, Johnson. Look, there's no poisonous spiders or snakes in Australia. That's a myth. But I think, yeah, look, it's a, you know, if we look at different articulations of place or country or whenua, vanua, wherever you're from in the world, there's all different ways of trying to articulate not land, but I mean, in Australia, we refer different parts of Australia. You know, we have over 110 different languages still in existence today in Indigenous Australia, and we don't really have words to describe land, but we've got many words to describe country, and that's why we would rather say we belong to country, we don't own land. So it's a sense of belonging to place rather than ownership, and I think that's a really subversive way to speed up the demise of capitalism. And I think what's really important for us is the insignificance of humans in a way in the non-human world, and I think that's what's really important when we put ourselves in place in the cultural practices of a country. You know, and one thing I've focused on that for many years is in Gamilaroi we call them dulu, which are trees, and our relationships to trees are really important because they not only sustain life in terms of turning carbon dioxide into oxygen, but there's a clear articulation between trees and the cosmos, the relationship to ground, to sky, to creating nutrients in the earth, to the matriarch, to birth, to death. There's a whole range of things that connect those systems, and I think what I'm trying to explain here is our systems are not separate. There's no separation in the world, and I think in Western discourses and Western philosophical discourses, and colonisation was about the disembodiment of people from place, but also the separation between things. And I think that's had a real dramatic effect on the world, and that's where capitalism comes from. It's separate, has real effect in the world, but in reality, it's not real in terms of the human and non-human, but it has real effect and negative effect. And I think it's about reminding us what actually connects us all. And we know until recently, when we look at something like the COVID pandemic was an interesting thing, because that really connected us very quickly and reminded us that we are quite insignificant and we have real effect on each other. And I think that's a really important lesson to take from when the world puts something out there. We have to listen to it. And I think we tend to forget that we are so connected to place and to each other.
Kia ora, Brian. Thanks for that. Rākau. I just hear rākau. So that's our kupu for trees. And instantly, and how you talked about the soil, the cosmos, and nutrients. This is so much in this mahi that Jess and Joe and I were doing on the image that we just had up before. This interconnectivity, and it's we sort of came up with an idea around it being atua centric. Within design space, at least human-centered design has been very popular for a very long time. And we know that putting humans at the center of things doesn't tend to end in good results. And I just struggle to understand why it's still the most sort of common design methodology around the world when it's having such a big effect on the lives of many of us. Thinking of design, segue to you, Dory, because I know it's very much your sphere, and I think we're all, as artists, as creatives, as academics and writers, I think we're all very connected. But I think this is a nice little connection to the design space, I guess, and how you think and write about. And I know in a very different position to being specifically Indigenous academics, designers, or researchers, someone within a BIPOC space. And approaching things from your perspective. So yeah, it'd be great to hear your take on again the kōrero, the conversation so far.
Yeah. So I guess again, I've been so blessed to have been invited in many ways as a guest to many different places. So I've again lived in Narm on lands and waters claimed by Australia, Takaranto lands and waters claimed as Canada, and now in Tongvagar, which are lands and waters claimed by the United States. And there was one event that I went to in Narm where, again, a group of like Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and then BIPOC people all together. And someone was talking about being able to trace like their connection to the land, like 20,000 years. And there was a feeling of, I don't know, sadness is probably not the way to explain it. Let's just say difference, because again, the African American journey and relationship to land is super complicated because of the roles of colonization. So again, living in the United States, I have deep, painful conversations with other African Americans about the fact that this is not our land. And again, having moved to so many different places where your sense of being a guest is very heightened by the fact that you're there mostly in a temporary basis, or the assumption of a temporary basis. So I'm constantly in this process of trying to figure out, again, as a guest, what does it mean to be in positionality vis-a-vis Indigenous sovereignty as a land, right? And I want to sort of like thank Brian in some ways in terms of kind of the way in which he's talking about country and how that's different from land, because that's has so deeply influenced like my understanding of land as a place of belonging, right? In a way, and what it means to not have the same depth of belonging. But what emerged out of the conversation is that, okay, if you have all these people with a depth of belonging, there also has to be a group of people who travel across and through these places of deep belonging to be able to share ideas and to share perspectives. And that in some ways I think is like I think I was always that person, and then it got credentialized in some ways by becoming an anthropologist, even though I was fighting constantly against the discipline and the discipline history itself. And then because I'm an academic, but I'm also super practical in terms of like the kind of impact you want to make. That connected me to design, because design is the way in which we, again, create the conditions in which we can remake the world to something more just, more equitable, more decolonial, in that sort of way. And so my perspective is one of like constant shifting positionalities as I've shifted places, but also trying to figure out what does it mean specifically to put Indigenous first, right? In my thinking and in my actions, so in the US, in the context of the US, it's putting Indigenous first. A lot of the energy in some ways is about confronting consistent attempts of Indigenous erasure, right? And as an African American, what is the role of that group in that erasure? So like if we go to the slides, and go to the third slide, there. So this is a thing where, first of all, I was just trying to figure out what BIPOC identity was, because my understanding of the term POC originally came from Black women trying to be more inclusive of everyone else. And so I was trying to figure out how Black people got excluded from that. But again, as multi-generational African Americans, like our experience is not an immigrant experience. Our relations to the land is very different, like brought involuntarily, brought as labor. And again, using that labor as, again, let's say, in some ways, a move towards innocence, to kind of refer to, decolonization is not a metaphor in Eve Tuck and that work. It's like it's a move towards innocence in the sense like we didn't want to be here in any way, right? So we're not colonizers in the same sort of way. But again, it's like if we talk about the history, there's been great history of solidarity. Native American communities, African American communities have fought side to side against colonizers. But again, you also have Buffalo Soldiers who were part of the attempted genocide of, Native American folks. Again, you had Native American communities that held African Americans as enslaved people. So it's always trying to like figure that out. But coming to the realization that if we want to be liberated as African Americans, then we have to align ourselves with the Indigenous positionality of sovereignty as the land, because anytime we choose to be on the side of the colonizer, we choose to, again, be participants in that colonizing system in ways that, again, hurt us as well as everyone else in the land. And again, there's so many different experiences of like coming again to NARM, and understanding like how Blackness and indigeneity are kind of conflated in the Australian context, right? So it's like Black with a K is the way I talk about it. And then what does it mean to be, again, positioned within that? But also, again, having enough of an understanding and an institutional relationship where it's like, okay, what can I do to be, quote unquote, part of a reconciliation action plan? What can I do in terms of like taking seriously, again, I feel like Oit Carolyn Briggs is in my head all the time in terms of like the welcome to country. And like, we ask you to come, you're fine to come, but do not harm the land, do not harm the waters, do not harm the children. So what does it mean to listen to that deeply and then put that into practice, especially in a design curriculum where, again, there's this amazing power to rebuild the world based on kind of indigenous principles or Aboriginal and Torres Strait principles of, say, respect, know, care, and share, and to build that in such a way that, again, young people who are coming in, and let's say at Swinburne University of Technology, where I was teaching at the time, like it was a global institution. So how do you welcome in people coming from Malaysia, people coming from India, people coming from China, people come from all over the world into a system that is not colonial Australian, but a system that actually is grounded in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander ways of knowing and being and caring, right? And then again, I think in Takaranto, coming into a position of power is I think the lesson in that was learning true humility. Because like again, having power is really important because power gives you the ability to protect. And it took me a long time to figure out, because, you know, like my sense of power is normally being abused by that power. But to realize, like, oh no, power gives you the ability to protect, the ability to protect ideals and individuals and communities that are vulnerable to the harm that these institutions could do. So embracing power, but having to do so with humility, and that humility of being able to put Indigenous first. And I'm so grateful to my colleagues at Ocata University in terms of trusting me enough to call me into accountability of when I've done something that was harmful to their community, that I was showing my ignorance, to feeling like trusting enough to say, pull me over to the side and say, Dory, you need to stop doing that because it is actually harming our relations to one another. And to take that, like, not with a sense of ego and getting hurt, but again, recognizing that as an act of love, as an act of wanting to maintain harmonious relations and understanding that we're in relationship with each other. And so I think all of these different experiences, that like what it helps you to do is see the difference in different Indigenous communities because of their history, because of their relationships to the land, but in some ways like helps you understand the way in which that connection to the land and connection to a different set of principles and ways of being creates a commonality of experiences in terms of welcoming you in as a guest, of understanding of being in relationship, of interdependence, and again, just this experience of deep generosity. And so I've been, you know, the way I think about like that positionality and working across all these different systems and principles and meaning is like, okay, everyone keeps telling you in one way or another, just be a good guest, right? Just be a good guest. And being a good guest is, again, like if you go to a place, you don't try to take over their home, right? As a good guest. If you clean up after yourself, you put on your best behavior, right? Authentic, but not the worst aspect of your authentic selves, right? You don't cause trouble. Like I've traveled so many places in terms of in the trust of other people's hospitality, and the way in which you repay that hospitality is to not place their reputations, to not place, in some ways, their lives, if they're having to come rescue you, in harm's way, right? As an obligation, right, of being a good guest. And that, I guess, to me, like, why I keep asking myself, like, why is this so hard for so many people? And again, I recognize that it's hard for me, but it's as time passes, it gets easier and easier and easier, because in some ways, like, in the life you live in trying to practice Indigenous ways of knowing and being, to practice, let's say in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, context, respect, know, care, and share. It's like, why would someone not want to live every day under these principles? Like, why would you choose something else, right? So it gets easier in that way, because again, there's a really generous and open host. And I only think that the fear, like, I've done a lot of presentations and I kind of ask, again, other non-Indigenous audience members, like, what are you afraid of? What makes you so afraid of Indigenous sovereignty? And it goes back to projection, where they're afraid that Indigenous people will treat them as cruelly as they've been treated and put them on boats and send them back to where they come from. And this is the part where, again, the Takaranto experience and the fact that so much of, like, things that we talk about in terms of, like, 7 generations and things that we talk about, like, it's very real to, like, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which is like an 1.5-hour drive. So it's not abstract, it's actually very real and tangible and lived. That, like, the ideal of the two-row wampum, right? Where, again, it's like, can we share in friendship and in peace? And so I guess it's always, I'm in the active part of listening of what it means to try to live a life under Indigenous ways of knowing and being, so that, and then my relationship to institutions is like, how do we put those things in place, whether it's a company, whether it's a school or a university, because the more people live under those principles, then the less fear that they have when Indigenous sovereignty comes. And as we're seeing the acceleration of the downfall of capitalism, especially here in the United States, again, as people have to seek a meaningful set of values by which to live besides greed and exploitation and domination, again, it is the Indigenous ways of knowing and being that will bring us true liberation from all of those systems. And so to be in a position to embrace that and not be afraid of that is really what I hope that a lot of my work is about.
Oh, kia ora, thank you, Tori. I'm running out of paper here, guys. Write down notes. But a really cool thing I picked up on that, which I think connects across, and so did Ed S in the chats there, was about being action focused. I think a lot of what you talked about was being action focused and not necessarily just being about connecting with Indigenous peoples and understanding Indigenous perspectives, but actively working as allies to make change, actively trying to do things, as opposed to just, it's like questioning power isn't enough to deconstruct or pull that power down. We need to be active, kind of in that. When I heard about kind of how you worked across some of those spaces, I hope some people took a screen grab as well of that image we had up, because that's really, I think, useful for me at least, and others who aren't in your space, to sort of understand the complexity, some of the headspace this takes up for us. But you talked about, I guess, how you connect across all these different spaces. And again, in our world, being a shapeshifter, is a really powerful thing, a really powerful metaphor. I think it's something that's embedded in us almost as a survival mechanism that we as in Indigenous or Black people, particularly in places like academia, we need to be very different people often to who we are within our own communities and our own cultures. We've got this sort of shape-shifting ability that enables us, I think, to get around and change the world and work together. So thank you for all your whakaaro. I'm going to shift over to Keita, who we haven't heard anything from yet, but she's going to lead us into some of our next question that we've got here.
Kia ora, Johnson. Thank you for the handover. Kia ora, everyone. My name is Keita, and as Johnson mentioned a little bit earlier, I have the privilege of being the co-host. I get the awesome privilege of talking with Brian and also with Dory. So we'll start with Brian. Actually, let me just say, Johnson's run out of paper. My mind is completely blown by the kōrero that we've just had. So thank you three for all of your amazing whakaaro. Brian, we're going to move to you now, Ehua, my friend. So one of the differences in how Indigenous people experience the world is how we practice reciprocation. Like reciprocation for us is a really, really big thing. So connection to whenua, connection to country, connection to each other is one part, and reciprocation is another really important part. And oftentimes we are providing reciprocation to people who don't necessarily deserve this beautiful gift that we give them in reciprocation. But our tipuna have taught us, our ancestors have taught us that it's about give and take, not just about take. And we were wondering if you might share some of your experiences around the reciprocal practices and how in your experiences this has changed some of the global systems we're in.
Yeah, thank you, Keita. If I can probably start by using one of the slides that were provided, like the first slide. I think to show you, to demonstrate this in action, I can use the example of some cultural materials that were taken. If we think about the onslaught of ethnography and anthropology around the world, and the removal of cultural materials, also ancestors, the body, and our culture in so many different ways, into museums globally, not only in Australia, but I think there's on record there's about 70,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander materials held in the British Museum, for example. The pilfering under the doctrine of discovery is really important to locate that. And, Norm Sheen, Wiradjuri man and academic, talks about this doctrine of discovery, and the doctrine of discovery really located country and place as inert and passive. So people and country is inert, passive, ready for the taking. So you can take what you want. It's a really important thing. Uncle Charles Moran and Uncle Greg Harrington, Norm Shield, in their on-country design, describe colonisation is designed on the patterns of disregard and self-regard. I think that's really important, because if a place and people are passive and inert, and then you've got a power that comes in through the doctrine of discovery based on disregard and self-regard, then as Indigenous people, we don't stand a chance ideologically, physically, materially, in so many different ways. And I think that's where the idea of taking comes from. That's where it's placed spiritually, physically, ontologically, every way possible. That's where it comes from. So it's really important for us to understand how this idea of taking operates. And in Indigenous Australian view on that is Mary Graham, who's a Comberi Waka Waka elder and academic, says for most Westerners, inquiry precedes place, but for us, place precedes inquiry. That's a really important thing, because she turns, like Descartes' axiom, I think, therefore I am, to I am located, therefore I am. So it takes us out of the human world into whānau, country, whatever we want to call it. That's really important, because if you belong to a place, it's not yours for the taking. So we don't take. And just to give that a premise, this tree that's on the screen here with Wayne Griffiths and myself and Greg Griffiths, this is one of our Gamilaroi Bora trees. And Bora and Gamilaroi is our law. This is a yarran. Yarran is a river red gum. And this tree could be anywhere, we don't know, potentially 300 years old. And this is our Gamilaroi language. This tree was chopped down in the late 1800s, taken to the Australian Museum, and then purchased by Lucas Stalin, a Swiss collector, who then gifted it to a museum in Basel in Switzerland, where it's lived for 85 years. If I can go to the next slide. And the smoking ceremony here was about blessing the place, protecting the tree, because to give, I can't go into deep discussion about the markings on the tree, because Bora is actually in the secret sacred realm, because it's about initiation, a whole different things. And Bora trees were not really for the public to look at. So it's really complicated because they fall within the secret sacred. And the Museum de Cultural Basem, I was with a team of researchers when we went to Switzerland, and we came across this tree in 2022, and they asked if they could show the dulu, the tree, in an exhibition called Alive More Than Human Worlds. And I said, well, wait, I need to go back home and talk to elders to seek permission whether we can show this, the dulu, the tree. But it's an interesting thing, because that started the conversation. The museum asked if they could show it. Other museums don't ask, and that's what really set up the relationship. And when they asked if they could show the dulu, the tree, I said, yes, well, I'll find out. Would you like to give it back? Would you like to return it? And the immediate answer was yes. It was incredible, because the premise of relationality and when we talk about this idea of give and take is really interesting. So we then had discussions about would like to return something in exchange. And if you see the tree in the background, that's a new tree carved by Wayne and Michael Griffiths, which now is located in the Museum de Cultural in Basel. And the dulu came home in December last year, so it's returned back to Gamilaroi country after 85 years. Now, the important thing about this is this what I term relational return is premised on, there's a drawing I've done there. We made a film in a background about a smoking ceremony we held. There's this provocation of creative practice that intersects with the return. So it's not just this idea, give it back, and that's it. That this idea of practice-led provocation was quite beautiful, because it does a couple of things. Relational return takes us out of the ethnographic past and locates us into the present, which is a really important thing, and also at the same time, it creates a dynamic for publics, like, for example, in Switzerland, to tell the Swiss people that if you return cultural materials to source communities, museums are not going to be emptied. So it does all these different things, and I think that's what's really important. And the reciprocal nature that Katie, that you talked about, what's really important is I realised this really clearly when the Museum Commission in Basel, when I met with them, because I had to go for a process of approval from the Museum Commission approving the return, the university approving return, and then the canton, the local government approving the return. When I met with the Museum Commission, the board asked this question. They said, we've come to realise that we cannot return the tree back to your community unless you give us one in return. Why is that non-negotiable? Because I said, and that's not negotiable. You need to take something back. And they said, we don't understand that. Why would you do that? And I said, because we're not taking it. You're giving it back. We will not take it through violence the way you have. And they said, but why would you do that? And it was simple. I said, because we're not you. And it's very clear that we have to care for our ancestor. Our ancestors lived there for over 85 years. We can't just walk into a place and take it. It's almost asking, do our doula, do our ancestor wants to come home? Because for us in doula and bora, there's a person inside that tree, you know. So this is you know, really important for us. So it's really the reciprocal exchange in this case is premised on the fact that you know, I wouldn't go into a neighbouring country in Australia, like onto, you know, Barkinji country, and go take something and take it back home. My own elders would be looking at me, why'd you do that for? What's wrong with you? It's just not in the nature to take. And I think that goes against the whole premise of the doctrine of discovery, goes against the whole premise of ethnography, a whole range, going back to what Jessica was saying, goes against capitalism, because capitalism is about taking. So I think, you know, and what Dora was talking about, this idea of responsibility, we have a relational accountability and ethical responsibility and accountability to people, place, and I suppose this is an example, a really good example of a relational return between practice-led research, Indigenous knowledge, and so on. So I hope that answers the question. Yeah, Marva.
I think it's fair to say that, yeah, that you answered that question beautifully based on the number of reactions that your kōrero, what you shared, got from our audience. And I firstly want to say thank you very much for sharing that, but also sharing it in a way that kept the secret sacred. So, you know, really, really appreciate that. I love that story, and I love the gift of reciprocation and the idea that it, you know, you're not taking something, you're giving something, and turning that entire thing around to being something that is incredibly empowering and incredibly motivating for whānau, for hapori, for other people. So, you know, it's an incredible story. Rather than me stand here and waffle or sit here and waffle, I'm going to go back to our panelists, because I'm sure they've got a lot to share. Jessica, did you want to have a kōrero, or do you want to weigh in on what Brian shared with us?
Yes, I just am really taken with your kōrero, Brian. Tēnei he mihi aroha kia koe kia koutou. To hear stories of country from other tangata taki is always a really special thing as an Indigenous person. The kōrero and the kupu, so the talk and the words of relational return, make me think about food sovereignty and how that language can be so helpful when we're thinking about Indigenous food sovereignty. Because one of the things through the rangahau, through the research that we've come to understand about Indigenous food sovereignty, is one fundamental aspect of it is that it has a connection to wairua, a connection to spirit. But that connection to spirit is found on that relational return that we literally have with our hands in hiniahuoni, in the soils, or holding our traditional seeds, or consuming food that our tūpunora ancestors have eaten, and then our gut bacteria gets to have this relational return. We get to decolonize our puku, or our stomach. We're having this relational return to remember the foodways through our divine senses as Indigenous peoples. And so I just really want to mihi to you, to greet you, and to thank you for that beautiful term, because I can see that it would be really helpful to be able to use that in the Indigenous food sovereignty space. It also too, I think, is really helpful when we are countering in a gentle way the ongoing participation by Indigenous peoples in industrial colonial agriculture. And that's just a result of colonisation. But the majority of Māori agribusiness is still spraying chemicals on the land. It's still operating in global commodity markets. And if we have this relational return on a deep level, so, you know, deep ecology, connected to wairua, connected to spirit, then maybe there's a whakaoho, or an awakening in that happens in that return, that actually we now don't want to be the people that are going to spray pesticides and chemicals on the land. Although that turns $1 for our tribal authorities, our return is so deep that we can no longer bear to poison the land anymore. And I think that's the change that definitely happens that I see with Indigenous peoples, people who have just started to come to their gardening practice, and definitely for myself, when we fall in love with our soil microbes. You know, when you have that relational return in the soil and you no longer want to even put in a little garden trail or a little garden fork into the soil, because you know that those are the mukapuna or the grandchildren of Hiniahuoni, of our deity of the soil, then that's such a deep relational return that it actually changes your whole gardening practice to now being chopping and dropping and not disturbing anything under that top layer of soil. So he mihi atu kia koe, Brian. Yeah, lovely kōrero. Kia ora.
Ngā mihi, just that's a really awesome connection there. I love the relational return. I love the decolonising your puku. I don't ever think I've thought about it that way, and that's really awesome. Looking at our time, I'm going to keep us moving. Dori, would you like to weigh in on the kōrero as well?
Yeah, I just want to say I appreciate so much like the conversation about like connection to land and foodways. Because of the deregulation that's happening right now in the United States, like we can trust even less our food system and the safety of it. And so what a lot of us have been talking about, especially I think here in California, because if people don't know, like the majority of the agricultural products for the entire United States is grown on stolen indigenous land in the Central Valley of California. Talk about like, so we do composting, so we see all the worms, and I'm getting over my discomfort with cockroaches because of the important role they play in the ecosystem. And so like the soil for our spaces, and this is urban, like I'm downtown, you know, Los Angeles, so very, very urban space, but everyone's really focused on like now creating, you know, again, gardens to go back to native species, because of all of like the colonization has decimated the ecosystem, which is resulting actually in the horrendous fires we've had a couple of weeks ago, 5-6 weeks ago. And so again, it's a thing where someone reminded me that like you don't have to go elsewhere to connect to the land. You have to actually connect to the land, even in the most urban spaces that you are, and get your hands in dirt. And again, to observe again how things grow. Like I'm surprised to see like, oh, strawberries grow this way, or you know, like, okay, a Brussels sprouts grows on this really large kind of stem, and they're all sort of organized this way. And so again, like our reconnection to what is happening outside, but reconnecting to it in the inside, and understanding of like how our body functions and requires nutrients, and that's going to come from the soil and come from the quality of the water that we have. Like again, it just I'm in all of the harm that is happening right now in terms of like the deregulation that's happening and the pollution that's happening. It's also important to find possibilities and optimism in the fact that people are like, okay, we can't rely on the government. Let's rely on community. Let's rely on each other, and let's rely on our own relationship to the land itself in order to provide not just for us, but to provide for our communities and to provide for the most vulnerable in our communities as well. And that's, it's it reminds me in all this horror that is happening, like as we again return to Indigenous ways of knowing and being, that is our pathway out of the horror, right? That is happening. And so I love the reminder of like, oh yes, we are actually moving in the right direction, just not enough of us. But if we can amplify, then enough of us will be moving in that direction.
Dori, that's fantastic. Thank you. Again, we're talking about that relational return, and thinking about what you said about the deregulation that's happening, and what that leads to is that the mistrust that's kind of creating that relational return, right? Going back to communities, you're going back to your own hapori. You're now practicing Indigenous ways of living and being, and that's fantastic. So thank you very much for sharing your whakaaro, your thoughts with us. Seeing as I have you on the line, so to speak, really keen to have a bit more of a conversation with you. As Indigenous people, we are taught by our tipuna, our ancestors, that along with the privilege of being Indigenous comes a whole lot of obligations and responsibilities. And you've alluded to this in some of your kōrero so far. As Brian said, we don't use words like own when we're talking about land or country. Those aren't things that we talk about. Johnson's people, and I hope I get this around the right way, who have a saying, ko Aotearoa, ko Aotearoa, ko au. So I am the river and the river is me, right? So it's about that connection to land, to whenua, and the obligations that come with that. So as a multinational African American who has had the privilege of living in many parts of the world and on lands to which you are not Indigenous, you've worked with many different peoples and many different cultures, and you have a really unique point of view of how you can be in solidarity with Indigenous people and the obligation of being a wandering but good guest. Would you be able to share some of your insights on these experiences with us?
Yeah, I mean, I talked a little bit before about it, but I think it comes to, and maybe we'll go back to the slides. Like we go to slide number 6 in my group, where in some ways it's like a lot of it is about figuring out your positionality, and maybe positionality is actually not the right word. Like it's actually what's your relationality. Right? What's your relationality to Indigenous people and Indigenous sovereignty as the land? And again, it's a thing where it is so very specific to the lands and the histories of the communities that you are already in relationship with. It's just a matter of whether or not it's a good relationship or a bad relationship, but you are already in relationship. And so part of it is actually realizing that first part, you are in relationship, and figuring out your positionality is in some ways figuring out the way in which you want to make sure that you're actually in good relationship. Again, part of that is learning the colonial histories of the places where you are. And, this is part where your sources matter. Your sources matter in terms of like, this is not the time to go to Wikipedia. This is not the time to believe anything that you might find in the mainstream media. But again, going to community, and if not directly community, almost every community has a website that is full of history. This is the great thing about some of the social media tools, right? Is like community has been telling you through YouTube videos and through Instagram Reels and through their own web pages, who they are and what they're about, and so going to those sources first to learn so that you're not a burden, right? In terms of asking your questions, you're not a burden. You come in with the ability to engage in real exchange of knowledge and information and sharing of who you are if you start at the place of understanding the place where you're at. making mistakes, but also making real amends is really, really important. And like I said, I've been so blessed by the generosity of the many Indigenous communities that I've been invited into in some ways. And again, understanding that we are learners and we make mistakes, but also don't continue to make the mistake. You know, like you should never make the same mistake. Maybe twice, but definitely not a third time, right? So, and I think this is the part where, like, again, you know, Brian, what you're talking about of like relationality becomes really important because you reestablish the relationship by making real amends. And you don't actually get to decide what those amends are. It is the community that has felt harm that gets to decide what the amends are, and that's what makes them real. And so listening deeply to that, and then, you know, stop doing what you've done that's harmful. Just stop. Don't make excuses. Don't whatever. Just say, okay, this is wrong. And then listening to what are the real amends that are at. And then for me on the design side of it, like why this is so important, again, as design as something that, again, that it is our ability to remake the world in the values that we want to give form to, right? And so can we give form to things that, again, are liberatory? And by liberatory, it's just the ability to be able to say no to something that's going to harm you, your community, and the environment, right? That you all have to, you're all a part of. And joy is just connection. And again, like, again, being multi-generational African American, like a lot of that is centered for me on the body, because the definition of being an enslaved person is that you actually don't have autonomy over your body, right? So having that autonomy over your body, being able to say no to the harmful practices of capitalism, right, which results in broken bones and results in exhaustion and results in malnutrition and results in all those things. So to be able to say no to those things that are harmful, like that's like skip freedom, I want liberation, right? To be able to say no to all of those things. And then community, because again, our interdependency on one another is not, my body can't just be the only one that is liberated, right? And this is where, again, that there's embodiment in all the nature and the rocks and the soil and the water and the air and all those things around us. So they should be able to say no, right, to that which is harmful to them as well. And so I guess in that sense, like all of those things, like all of those are practices of being in solidarity. All of those are practices of really just trying to make sure in some ways that you're living up to your obligations as a person who's responsible for the own ways in which your attitudes and behaviors, again, do harm to others, right? And so, yeah, so for me, like that, like my experiences in all these different places has really been about the ways in which, again, my Indigenous friends and colleagues have helped deepen my understanding of what those things are and what they mean, so that they, in some ways, like again, you know, like Jess and Brian describes things in ways that it seems so natural to them, right? And the challenge of being is so deeply in the heart of Babylon, right, so to speak, is that it is being made to feel like those ways of being and thinking are unnatural. So it's only by, again, being in relationship with again, Indigenous colleagues and friends who, by their actions, by who they are, remind you that these other ways of being is natural and feel good and are liberatory. And that's how you come to embrace a different way of being.
Wow, that is you shared so much with us. Like thinking about some of the things that you talked about relates really heavily to what we call manaakitanga in Te Ao Māori, which is the art of being a fantastic host and the art of being a wonderful guest, one you want to have back again. There's something you said earlier that really, as a designer, resonates with me around how are you helping the colonizer? How are you helping the people who have colonized the space and place in the way that you're working or that you're being? And I love that you talked about, rather than going to ask Uncle Google or Wikipedia to find out about the places and people that you're going to, go to them. Like, go to their sources. They've been telling you who they are and where they are and what they believe in and what's important to them through their own mechanisms. So I think that's really, really awesome. And that's about knowing whose table you're going to, right? We talked very early about some of the commonalities that exist across Indigenous people. And I think everything that you've talked about here reflects those commonalities. Now, we've got around about 4 minutes left, so I'm really keen to offer Brian and Jess maybe a minute each to kind of add anything in that you want to around this kōrero, so we can wrap up and then let our live studio audience head away for the rest of their day. So, Jess, kai a koe te wā, kare?
Hi, kia ora koutou. Just really following on from Dory's conversation just then around what I'd describe as alliedship. Kaupapa Māori Indigenous researcher has described alliedship, non-Indigenous alliedship, as somebody who walks behind but walks alongside, or walks behind but not in front. And I think that's a really important tension to make explicit, because often in the spaces of non-Indigenous alliedship, all of a sudden non-Indigenous peoples, once they've spent a lot of time with us, can all of a sudden be taking that place as leaders or speaking on our behalf. So I think it's really important to remember about that space and that place. I've really enjoyed the whole conversation around positionality and standpoint. So important. And, we grapple with this, my wife and I, who's also too Indigenous, we live on Te Aotearoa whenua. So we live on land that that is currently occupied, but which is by non-Indigenous peoples, but which is not our tribal area. So we live outside our tribal area, and more recently, in the last 18 months, I've been using the word, we steward this piece of land. So we have a word in our culture called kaitiakitanga, maybe guardianship, but that's actually for me tied to having the mana or the authority over that piece of land. So we don't even see ourselves as kaitiaki, we see ourselves as stewards on this piece of land. But hoi anō koutou, mahi atu kia koutou, me te kaupapa, kia koutou katoa, mauri ora.
Ora, Jess, thank you very much. Brian, let's give you a minute.
Thank you. I don't know what else to say, but Muraba, thank you. I think we've said enough. Yeah, I think we're all deadly. When we say in Australia, deadly not mean dead. We're amazing. So, but yeah, no, I totally agree. I think, yeah, the whole premise of our relationship to, the matrix of relationships between people and people and people and place and country is one of the most strongest thing to have in for Indigenous peoples globally, and that's my experiences working in different parts of the world, from Greenland to the southeast of India, with Indigenous or tribal peoples, depending how people define themselves. That's what's really strong, is that relationship between people, the relationship between place. So Muraba, thank you.
Thank you very much. Brian, really appreciate that. I know that we had some questions, and unfortunately, team, we don't have the time to respond to those. What we might do is we might take that question, the questions that have been asked, and we'll pose them to the panelists, and then we can respond. We can send that out to the people who are attending, or maybe pop it into the video that we'll release around this webinar. Just want to take a moment to summarise. One of the things that Johnson and I have talked about in terms of being Indigenous designers is the commonalities, and we're bringing those through in this kōrero. And so if I think about some of the things that were shared today, I think one of the most important things that we've heard is it's about being Indigenous-led. So if you're doing Indigenous design, it has to be Indigenous-led by the Indigenous people who the work is for. And I think that is such an important point. We've heard about connection. We've heard about connection to place, to people, to whenua, to time. And that's another thing that I think runs through very thickly through Indigenous practices. Connection, reciprocation, right? Relational return. And I love that. Relational return, because we are not you. And we don't follow your ways. These are our ways. And I think those are such wonderful stories that you have all shared with us. So thank you very much, team. Jess, Brian, Dory, for your time. Johnson, for your time too, Ehua. Much appreciated for the wonderful kōrero, the beautiful insights and the knowledge that you have shared with us today. I'm going to say karakia whakamutunga. Kia tau te rangi Māori o rangi nui e tui honei, o papatuanuku e takoto nei, o te tai ao e awhi nei, ki rungi a tātou. Ti hei, Māori ora. Thank you very much, team.